Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue right along with our discussion on analyzing our discussion regarding the analysis of Vietnam. In our last lecture we examined Ho Chi Minh, who as a young man went to the Versailles Conference, went to the Versailles peace talks that ended World War One, and he had hoped to meet with U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, and impress upon Wilson the idea or the notion that the peoples of Vietnam, or the wider range of peoples who were then under colonial domination, should have the same rights or the same ability to choose for themselves, to have the same sort of ethnic determination, national determination um, to decide their national government for themselves. He was, of course, turned away. He had grossly underestimated Woodrow Wilson's interpretation of world powers, and more importantly, Woodrow Wilson's own personally held racist beliefs. And that would prove to be very faithful, because Ho Chi Minh would later go on to be embraced by the recently victorious Bolsheviks, and of course go on to become a great communist leader in Southeast Asia. We also looked at in our last lecture the failure of the American approach to Vietnam. Vietnam was never seen as an issue in and of itself. It was never seen as a recent addition, stage, or moment in a longer history. It was seen through the lens of the very short term and very recent eruption of the Cold War. It was always viewed as a part of the Cold War and not an issue in and of itself, or an issue in a long-standing tradition. And then also the approach to time. The early thoughts was that if the United States kept pressure on the Viet Cong long enough, that they would eventually grow tired and disillusioned, and of course surrender to the United States and resign themselves to either joining the non-communist government or simply allowing the non-communist government to continue to exist. Nobody had really studied Vietnamese history, and they did not really have this sort of this sort of appreciation for time that the Vietnamese had. It's been said before, but they had literally been fighting off Chinese imperialism for millennia. So the concept of 5 to 6 years in a struggle against the United States, to say that within months to short years, that they would simply collapse and fold and no longer want to engage in any sort of hostilities, would be incredibly short-sighted and comes off as really ludicrous in further examinations. Now, with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our topic for today, and we're picking right back off where we last left off, discussing Ho Chi Minh and his leadership role in Southeast Asia against French colonialism. Now, in 1945, Roosevelt was having second thoughts about decolonizing, about his decolonization sentiments. And these thoughts, these feelings, would be shared by his eventual successor, Harry Truman. Now, as the Cold War developed and increased in intensity, so did the need for the United States to have support from the established powers in Western Europe, namely France. The United States really needed the support of France and the United Kingdom. Support that was lent to one would have to be reciprocated to the other. So for the United States to receive the aid and support of the United Kingdom and France in Europe, against communism, the United States had to lend support to those two powers in preserving their long-term and long-standing colonial empires. Now, the final blows for any amicable dealing between the United States and Ho came in 1949 and the great victory for Mao in China, and of course the outbreak of the Korean War. Now, from that point on, the United States was determined to contain communism in Asia at all costs. The recent disasters in Korea and China also led to the development of Japan as the United States' major ally in East Asia to counterweight communist China. Now, Vietnam was a key region to contest communism due to its close proximity to the resource-rich region of the then Dutch East Indies, soon to become Indonesia, and of course the British colony of Malaya, soon to become Malaysia. Now, the irony of this new plan was really that less than 5 years before, during World War II, the United States had fought to contain Japan and to break Japan, and was now fighting to obtain for Japan that greater sphere of economic opportunity that she had desperately wanted in the late 30s and early 40s. Now, it is very important to note that the Japanese movement into French Indochine led to and it's really, in this series of events, is really quite funny. The Japanese movement into the French Indochine, led to the United States freezing of Japanese assets in 1941. That in turn led to the attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought hostilities to an opened hostilities between the United States and Japan. Now, United States support for the French during the 1940s failed to change the outcome of the French War in Vietnam. The United States did consider, but ultimately rejected, a plan to intervene directly and save Dien Bien Phu. The then Army Chief of Staff, General Matthew Ridgway, stood out in particular for his opposition to intervention. Now, the French in the 1954 Geneva Convention agreed to recognize Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian independence. Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, with French forces ordered to withdraw south of that line and Viet Minh forces ordered to withdraw north of the 17th parallel. It was decided that unification elections would be held 2 years later in 1956. Now, the United States refused to sign the Geneva Accords, stating that she would not disturb the agreement by force, but it was well known in American policy circles that the accord was seen as a great international disaster. The first in the line of dominoes to fall in Asia, as President Eisenhower would later put it. Now, to prevent this, to prevent the domino theory from going into full effect, of having all these nations fall to communism, the United States government decided to find and promote an anti-communist leader, and they found one in Ngo Diem, who was then a Vietnamese national living in exile in the United States. It was hoped that Diem would be able to establish a very strong and long-lasting anti-communist government that would stand in opposition to Ho's government in North Vietnam. Now, in the same manner that Syngman Rhee had done in China, that's what they wanted done in South Vietnam. Now, in South Vietnam, the French had established a puppet government headquartered in Saigon under Diem. Now, Diem sought to establish a successor government in South Vietnam that would serve as the plug to stem communism from further expanding. Now, if that government could serve, if that government was able to prevent to prevent the spread of communism, it would also serve to prevent members of the Democratic Party in the United States from claiming that the Republican Party had lost Indochina much the same way that the Republican Party had claimed that the Democrats had lost China, and they really used that to propel themselves in 1952 to capture the presidency. Now, Diem succeeded in wresting control of South Vietnamese of the South Vietnamese government from the last emperor, from the last Vietnamese emperor, Emperor Bao, who literally had the distinction of serving as reigning as emperor under both a French, Japanese, and later Franco-American protectorate / puppet governments. Now, Diem gained temporary control of the area below the 17th parallel, by the Geneva Accords of 1954, and the two Vietnams were to remain separate until unification elections in 1956. Now, in an effort to strengthen Diem's appeal, the United States poured aid into South Vietnam. It created an international league made up of East Asian countries to defend South Vietnam, and supported Diem's refusal to hold elections in 1956. It was widely held that if elections had been held, Ho would have won in 1956, and Vietnam would have been reunited under a very strong, well-directed, well-guided communist government. In effect, the United States, in supporting Diem's refusal to hold those elections, the United States decided to not only defend South Vietnam, but to move forward in a very powerful way to create it as the non-communist alternative to deter the spread of communism. Now, nation building has an element of American foreign policy had never really been done before. There had never been an attempt to conquer an area and make it self-sufficient as a national entity. But it did have precedence in American history. After all, Western expansion and admission of new states are all a part of this sort of nation-building tradition. After all, when you look at it, the federal government oversaw, along with state governments and settlers, of course, themselves, oversaw the expansion of the United States from 13 states straddling the Atlantic seaboard to a megalith republic straddling two coasts. When you really look at the development of, let's say, the old Northwest or the old Southwest or the Louisiana Purchase territory, you see the United States sort of nation building on a smaller scale. You see them sort of developing these large block territories like the old Northwest and dividing them into smaller territories once one territory was ready to be admitted in as a state. You can sort of look at that transition and the creation of the megalith republic has nation building. But nation building for the sake of not making the republic stronger, not enlarging the republic, but nation building has in developing one region to be able to strongly or adequately support, defend, and maintain itself really begins with the end of World War II, with the decision to rebuild and strengthen West Germany, in addition to rebuilding and strengthening Japan, and really sort of hits this critical juncture with Vietnam. In examining East Asian nations, we find that the United States was extremely successful in rebuilding the nation of Japan, but failed dismally in rebuilding the nation of South Vietnam. Likewise, we find that the United States was greatly successful in rebuilding and building up South Korea, but failed dismally in building and maintaining the Republic of China. So a very interesting sort of dynamic there to behold. But it begins improper. The official foreign policy of nation building begins improper with South Vietnam. South Vietnam appeared to be a brilliant success. It was the showcase of what American aid was capable of doing on the surface. The reality was far more malevolent. Diem's government was always in need of support, and in particular of foreign support. And this dug the United States deeper and deeper into Vietnamese affairs. At the same time, while the United States is aiding Japan, they're not having to dig themselves deeper and deeper into Japanese involvement or to shift focus. At the same time, to make this argument, to make this comparison more potent, to make it more, to put it in better perspective. At the same time, the United States is offering aid and support to South Korea. The United States is not digging itself deeper and deeper into South Korean affairs. They can offer this surface support of economic and policy aid to South Korean officials without having to engross themselves in the nitty-gritty details. They don't have to micromanage the way they did in South Vietnam. So the United States is digging itself deeper and deeper into Vietnamese affairs. Diem's rule is alienating much of the Vietnamese people. Diem was a centrist, and on top of that, he was a Roman Catholic ruling in an area that still had a very pronounced history of Buddhism and decentralized rule. As he moved to eliminate his domestic opponents, they fled north, where they organized, where they coalesced and they organized the NLF, the National Liberation Front, and they began to initiate guerrilla operations against Diem. By 1959, Ho's communist government, unwilling to accept the cancellation of elections, decided to support this insurgency with military aid. Now, the Kennedy administration believed in the doctrine of counterinsurgency as a way to counter communism globally. And the Kennedy administration decided to send in the newly created Special Forces, or Green Berets, along with other military forces to stop the communists from winning the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people, which they were doing. They were doing that, and doing a brilliant job of it too, if I can say so. Now, in 1963, that effort had failed miserably as well. With the failure of the initiative, the United States then sanctioned a military coup that overthrew Diem and assassinated him as well. Now, the death of Diem only made things worse in Vietnam, as strong men came in one by one, arriving to power via military coup and being dismissed from power via military coup. By 1965, the instability of South Vietnam's government set the stage for what was becoming clear and imminent victory for the communist forces. Lyndon Johnson, in this effort to stave off South Vietnam's collapse, ordered the bombing of North Vietnam for retaliation of a North Vietnamese attack on American warships in the Tonkin Gulf, the Tonkin Gulf resolution that we discussed in our last lecture. Now, the second reason for the escalation of force was domestic politics. Lyndon Johnson wanted to silence, he wanted to neutralize Vietnam as an issue in its upcoming presidential campaign against sitting senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater. The bombings and the Tonkin Gulf resolution served this purpose, and it served it very well. They factored significantly into Johnson's sweeping victory over Goldwater in 1964, but they count for much less in the conflict on the ground. So you begin to see the politicalization, the domestic politicalization and the ramifications of those policies in the United States is that Johnson sort of wins a great coup. He sort of orchestrates this great political coup against his opponent by ramping up these efforts, but these efforts don't accomplish anything on the ground in Vietnam. They more or less leave the situation the way it had been before these attacks. They don't change or alter anything. They only alter the perceptions that people have at home on the war, but not the perception of the people that you're fighting the war against. Now, the North Vietnamese, they were not intimidated in the least bit by Johnson's actions, and they continued their military campaigns against the United States. Consequently, Johnson decided in April of 1965 to launch sustained bombing actions against North Vietnam and to sending ground troops into South Vietnam officially to defend United States air bases, but in reality to conduct combat operations against communist forces from North Vietnam. In 1965, it was clear that the armed forces would need hundreds of thousands of troops and a completely new strategy that would be called search and destroy to really begin to counter North Vietnam. Johnson agreed he agreed to those to both of those points. And he did so to forestall the communist victory and for domestic reasons yet again. This time for congressional support for his great legislative plan, the Great Society. He needed to he wanted to bring in representatives, congressmen and women and senators to support his domestic legislation plan. And to do so, he had to be tough on communism. He had to have this bold foreign policy plan. It was what was needed, and it was what Johnson did. It was what he fell in line with and what he defended. Now, another motivation for this plan was to prevent partisan accusations that he was soft on communism or that he was losing the Indochine. We have to remember that this is the Cold War backdrop. These are unfolding during the Cold War times. The best way to think about this would be to see a president be called soft on terrorism in contemporary America. Imagine if Presidents George Bush Jr. or Barack Obama Jr., they were both labeled as soft on terrorism, or if someone laid the charge that they had lost all the groundwork, all the positive energy created in Iraq or Afghanistan. If those campaigns resulted in a failure because of a sitting president, think of the political capital, the opposition party, and whoever could be touted as the opposition candidate in the next election. Think of all the political capital they would have over that sitting incumbent president. Johnson wanted to forestall that argument once and for all. He was aware that charges that the Democratic Party had lost China, and that the Democratic Party was soft on communism, due to the stalemate in Korea, had been a key motivating factor in bringing the Republican Party into the presidency in the 1952 election, and that Eisenhower's own tough actions on communism around the world had seen him reelected in 1956. So, and Johnson was a member of Congress during both of those election cycles and during all of this, so he would have been keenly aware of partisan politics and how to maneuver, how to sort of veil perceptions. But yes, those that was a key motivation. And by 1968, the plan had largely succeeded. That the whole veiling reality plan had succeeded, and he had succeeded in preventing a major communist victory, but he had not defeated the communist government or the communist leaders. He had not broken their spirit. He had not broken their will to fight or their ability to fight. Now, the Tet Offensive of 1968 made it clear that in order to achieve complete victory in Vietnam, the United States military, and in particular the United States Army, would need hundreds of thousands of more troops and they would need to mount the type of war effort that was mounted against the Japanese during World War II. And really, even with all of that, there still wouldn't be a sort of timeline, a definitive cap for the end of the war. So it posed a major problem for leaders. One, you would need thousands of hundreds of thousands of more troops. You need to mount this Herculean war effort, and even with those two factors already in play, those two new demands in play, there still wouldn't be a guaranteed timeline for the end of the war. There would still not be a guarantee of victory at the end of this tunnel. Now, in misinterpreting the war, the United States underestimated the resolve of the Vietnamese. The United States viewed the North Vietnamese as puppets of the Soviet Union rather than as fierce nationalists with a millennia-long tradition of resisting invaders. While the war was ripping apart the fabric of the Republic, weakening the United States in ways that had not been seen since the lead-up of the Civil War nearly a century before, Vietnam by this time contained a very high percentage of the United States ground and naval forces. The rough estimate is that 40% of all combat-ready divisions and forces, army divisions and forces, fleets, as well as half of all tactical air support units, and roughly 1/3 of the fleet, of the global fleet, was involved in Vietnam. This commitment compromised the United States' ability to combat the Soviet Union should a war erupt with Russia. The war also brought the United States into conflict with her major European allies, who began to question aloud the ability of the United States to lead the coalition against communism. The war was also seen as a colonial war by the recently freed and almost free colonies of the major players. So this is 1968. You have places like that are just receiving independence, like Jamaica. Jamaica received its independence in 1966. You have places like Ghana that received their independence in the late in 1956. Right really in the shadow of Dien Bien Phu. You have places like India that are achieving these their independence and so forth. You have places like the Bahamas that would achieve independence in 1973, and places and other places like the Congo that would achieve independence after the Tet Offensive. They're all looking in on this, and they're all asking the same question. The United States is trying to draw us into their sphere of influence. They're trying to draw us into this global coalition they have, but they're fighting what we can all see is a pro-colonial war. They're fighting an imperialist war to deny indigenous populations the right to self-determination, and it's casting the United States in a very negative light. With that being said, we'll break here and we'll come back and we'll complete our analysis of Vietnam. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I am Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.